Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is April 19th, 2026, 2:25 p.m. So to continue on my global elite and spook posts, this will uh, continue the theme. So the series of posts, is partly intended to show how I gradually built my views on these subjects. And there are several facets to them and interactions between various dynamics. This is again, it's not one easy, it's not that easy to understand if people aren't thinking bigger picture. So yeah, it's details are nice, but you can really get lost in the weeds, this kind of stuff. Um, again, and Seattle, the Mormon financial empire was likely the prime mover behind what happened. But there were lots of other dynamics happening. And so, the electric companies, Washington's electric companies didn't need to be told what a threat Dennis Lee's efforts presented, which was billions of dollars in lost revenue, of the kind of bad load that Amory Lovins wrote about at that time. And Dennis, he saw these full page ads, begging for energy conservation by the electric companies, and he believed them. He believed the ads. He thought they were legitimate. They really were sincere. Well, they weren't, but it was all propaganda. But Dennis didn't figure that out until it was too late. And he thought he'd get a ticker tape parade from electric companies for bringing his heat pump that would save 85% over the electric resistance heating that so many people in Washington were using. So instead of a ticker tape parade, the opposite happened. And I've written and discussed a lot of Bill Delp. So Bill Delp, again, I only name him since he died last year. He was a corporate hitman, and he worked for the Bonneville Power Administration, the BPA, which was the ringleader of Washington's electric companies. So they were sort of the wholesaler for the electric companies. And in fact, when we were in Boston the year after the whole ordeal, one of our customers actually called the BPA's conservation department checking into Dennis. The guy was a banker. And anyway, got a call back from a guy in the conservation department at the BPA. And he was very cagey, but he did admit, he goes, for several months, all our department thought about was Dennis Lee. Yeah, so Dennis was this huge existential threat that the electric companies saw. And a federal bankruptcy court was in on it. They allowed Bill's fraudulent lawsuit to strangle Dennis's company as he was fighting off all sorts of other assaults, which again, then the company was stolen by Mormon grifters, which my boss was the enabler from the inside on that. And killing one of Dennis's employees didn't even. A woman died because of Bill, and that didn't even slow Bill down. So, and then Bill also worked closely with Betsy, the hatchet lady at the Attorney General's office, and taking the company down. In fact, when she had her nose rubbed in her crimes enough, her conscience kind of awoke and she quit. In fact, Dennis, I briefly mentioned this in my writings. Later had an amazing encounter with Betsy. So, a year later or something, Dennis was getting on an airplane, maybe Seattle, something like that. He was getting on an airplane. And anyways, he's about to sit down, and the seat next to where he was going to sit down was Betsy. She was sitting there. And so, anyway, so Dennis, he was kind of surprised, shocked. Again, these kind of coincidences are so common in my journey and Dennis's. Anyway, so Dennis, he said, Betsy, I don't need to sit here. I can sit somewhere else. And Betsy said, no, that's just fine. Go ahead and sit down. Anyway, so Dennis sat down next to Betsy for their plane flight. And so, anyway, so Dennis, basically the first thing he asked Betsy, he goes, so Betsy, how do you sleep at night? And basically she defended herself. She said, well, you'll notice I don't work there anymore, again, for the Attorney General's office. And then she essentially said she was following orders. So she basically apologized. Her excuse for what she did to Dennis's company was she was just following orders. And when Dennis told me this story, amazing story, years later, and Dennis goes, that was Eichmann's defense at Nuremberg. So Yeah, I'm not Nuremberg. Ha, he wasn't Nuremberg, he was in Israel. But anyway, yeah, those Eichmann's defense is just following orders. So this was, yeah, Dennis didn't think it was a very good excuse for Betsy. And as I've written plenty, she then taught law school and got disbarred several years ago for looting more than $100,000 from her client's bank account. And Betsy was the best of them who was sick on Dennis over the years. And those events, and so the events, and I could go on a long time, which I won't, about many events in Seattle. I saw quite a few of them, but most of the fireworks happened before I came. But eventually, through Dennis and others who were involved in those days, Dennis's books, etc., I learned a lot more about what happened there in Seattle. And the Seattle experience is really the earliest example for me of what I came to call the 1% conspiracy and 99% complicity situation. Yeah, so the Mormon financial empire, they were probably the prime movers of what happened, but they had lots of help from lots of people who eagerly stepped up, got their hands bloody, with the blood of the innocent for personal gain. So, and all that happened before we ever started talking about free energy. So, and that's when it really began to become surreal. And I mentioned here in prior posts, when we were in Boston, we heard from the so-called white hats and black hats, which were basically two factions of the global elite. So again, the black hats made us the $10 million offer, the friendly buyout offer. The white hats were giving Dennis encouraging phone calls in the night. Yeah, so this was, and again, a number of other events, officials sharpening their axes, similar to what happened, similar like they did in Seattle, similar to what they're about to do in Ventura, similar that Dennis has been constantly suffering from for, we got 50 years or so. And the man that we hired to run the operation, so we moved to Ventura because my mentor told Dennis to move the operation to Ventura if they wanted to work together. We hired a guy to run the operation there in Boston, and he soon tried to steal it. And again, I already seen our company stolen in Seattle. Anyway, I would soon come to learn this was normal. Yeah, so our associates trying to steal it all was just that was standard behavior, which was more of the early how to say it, my education in my Germany's primary lesson that personal integrity is the world's scarcest commodity. I didn't make that up one day. It was just through seeing these kind of behaviors over and over and over again. Again, soon after hit Ventura, I witnessed more attempts to steal our company. And one day I told Dennis how shocking it was to see all these people trying to steal our company. And Dennis's reply was, he said, "Well, the first 50 times I saw it, I was shocked too." Yeah, so this is how it is. Yeah, this is how it is in the business world. So, but then the rocket took off when Dennis hit on a national program, national ad campaign. In fact, actually, it wasn't too big. It was ads about this big in USA Today on selling kits on how to sell, build, and install his heat pump, which is the world's best heating system. In fact, still is. In fact, there's still a tremendous, awesome market for it. And again, it's been totally wiped out in North America. As I've discussed many times, there's a company in Portugal that makes them, which is the only company in the world I know that still makes them. And they advertise 85% heating savings. Yeah, it's the best heating system in the world. Has been for a long time. In fact, I'm going to do a video on that one of these days. Anyway, when his ad campaign worked, money started flooding in around the country. And we went from a few volunteers to 40 employees in about 2 months. In fact, had at least a second building. And around Christmas that year. And I mentioned that Dennis had one of his friends from his youth he hired as kind of a salesman guy for him. And they were buddies, and they would stay in the office late in the evenings those days, drinking and watching movies and having fun. That was the most fun I saw Dennis have while I was with him, I think, ever was then. And in fact, in December of that year, December of 87, again, I moved out by that time. I lived with Dennis in Sound for about a year, but I lived about 10 minutes from the office then. Anyway, that evening, I remember that evening, I went back to the office around like 11 p.m. or something to to drive a drunken dentist home, to the house I used to live in with him. And anyways, I helped have, because he's a paraplegic, can barely walk. And so when he was half drunken, he had a hard time walking. And so I was kind of half dragging him to my car to take him home. And then he stopped. And in our parking, I looked around and he was looking at our buildings, the two buildings we had, what we had going on. And he just said that, and he called them the big boys, so the global elites. And we didn't know they were global elites at the time, but Dennis called whoever these big interests were the big boys. And he said the big boys' eyes had to be bugging out, seeing what we had going. And Dennis was probably right. In fact, I remember thinking back then that if we were not stopped soon, they may not be able to stop us soon. Well, that was grimly prophetic. And so, I was raised only a few miles from the county seat. In fact, I lived with Dennis. It was only a few miles. So much of my life happened within like a 5-mile radius. Less than that, like a 5-mile diameter almost. Again, just a few miles between where I was raised, where I went to school, where my girlfriends were, where I got married, where Mr. Professor lived, where our offices were, where my mother worked at the newspaper. This was all within a few minutes. I mean, all of it was in a few minutes drive of each other. Where I got my first jobs, all this kind of stuff. So I was raised just a few miles from the seat of the county government, which was this new center, the government center, which was built. In fact, I watched it being built back there in the 70s. And I was raised only a few miles from it. And I had no idea that Ventura County was often considered the most corrupt county in the United States. Yeah, they don't tell you that growing up there. And so I was about to find out, though, the hard way. And what I didn't know, so literally when Dennis was saying how their eyes must be bugging out, well, the wheels were already grinding to take us out. So there was an investigation opened by the sheriff's department into us there in late 1987. And in fact, Dennis's assistant called the guy because the Better Business Bureau was forwarding calls to him, inquiries to him, and our assistant talked to him. And anyway, I call him Mr. Deputy because he's still alive, but he lied to our assistant, saying, "Oh yeah, it was just a perfunctory investigation. He'll soon close it, etc." That was the first of many big lies we heard from these people. And because just a few weeks later, on January 14th, 1988, we were raided, and which began my life's worst year. And that raid was a death blow that was aimed at our company. They seized practically all our records. But I also began learning that day, but the next morning it became evident that the raid was also an espionage exercise, as they completely ransacked and cleaned out Mr. Researcher's office before their official search began. So they stole everything. They stole all our technical information. And it was like, who'd they steal that for? I doubt it was for their own perusal. So my guess, I think a pretty good guess, is that information eventually ended up in the hands of the global elite. They want to see what we're up to. And so, I think that's what happened. And Mr. Researcher was never the same after that. Yeah, he was a lot of what they stole was actually documents that had been entrusted to him. The stuff that was entrusted to him was stolen. So yeah, he never recovered from that. But this is an example of where public officials worked directly on behalf of the spooks. Yeah, so there was this, they did the raid and then they handed off the documents to spooks. So and I doubt that Mr. Deputy and his cronies knew who they stole the documents for or why. They didn't care. They're just hitmen. So it was all corrupt. So anyway, he was dangled a big carrot, a big promotion, and he got it. The case made his career. Yeah. Case-making career. His sidekick also got promoted. So this is all, promotions all around for those who get their hands bloody. In fact, very similar, as I would later find out about the JFK assassination cover-up. Gerald Ford, Earl Inspector, these guys are active in the covering up JFK's murder, and they become senator and president. This kind of stuff. So this is an MO a pattern that I eventually recognized. Then again, the prosecutor act more to be a judge. This is all. The corruption in Ventura County, I almost want to say it beggars the imagination, but I lived through it, so I didn't have to imagine much. And actually, one of the greatest events in those days, I didn't find out about it until I read it in Dennis's book back in 1996, which was the CIA's $1 billion offer to Dennis to fold the operation. In fact, I read that, I think in the summer of '96, about the same time that I heard Ron Waugh tell me his story of being a Justice Department investigator and getting involved in a situation where a guy invented a high mile per gallon carburetor and his life was threatened by an American car company. And he sort of mediated the outcome where they raised the offer by 100 times and the guy got $50 million instead of $500,000. So that we got the $10 million offer, which again, it took me another, it wasn't until '98 that I realized that that $10 million offer in Boston was the standard friendly buyout offer. And then raising it to $1 billion the next year, it was fit right in. Yeah, so Gurr got dangled $2 billion a few years later. Stan Meyer said he got offered $1 billion, and this increased the bid by 100. I kept hearing that again. I've seen that a number of times. So it's like this is all part of the playbook. And then when Dennis turned down the offer, in fact, he counteroffered and told the CIA guy, "How about they give it back to the global elite, and that's earmarked for bringing free energy to the world?" And the CIA man choked on his soup and said he couldn't accept that counteroffer. He'd have to talk to his superiors. And then again, a couple weeks later, he came by Ventura to see Dennis, had dinner, and in fact, Gary Ween wrote about this in his book. That often when they're going to kill you or take you out like this, they will do stuff like throw a party for you or this kind of thing. And anyway, it's like, in fact, Gary called like the kiss of death or something. And anyway, the CIA guy, I think, did it with Dennis. And in fact, I think when he visited Dennis, so instead of paying Dennis $1 billion, he probably spent $10 million to grease palms in Ventura there on his trip to arrange for Dennis's subsequent treatment. So Dennis was arrested with $1 million bail just a few weeks later. And so this is a classic. In fact, I'm the one I think coined this in the free energy field. I've seen others use it, like Brian O'Leary used it, et cetera, but I call it the offer you couldn't refuse. Yeah, so anyway, this was an offer Dennis couldn't refuse. And so you refuse the offer, and well, you're going to really regret not taking that offer. And so anyway, Dennis ended up, spending tears behind bars. Shouldn't have survived the experience. And then in Seattle, Bill Delp and worked with Betsy on what I've come to call the inside-outside job. And I've heard about it. I've heard about it in other situations too. So this is apparently part of the playbook. So they infiltrated a provocateur on the inside of the company. And what happens is that as the corrupt officials in the media, et cetera, are attacking from the outside, then this provocateur tries to incite a mutiny on the inside, and basically to collapse the target organization. So this is so in Seattle it was Bill Delp and Betsy. Well, in Ventura it was Mr. Deputy and a guy named Ken Hodgel. He was the inside guy. So he was another Mormon. He wasn't the guy who led the theft of Dennis's company after he got arrested with $1 million bail. So he and Mr. Deputy also did an inside-outside job. This seems to be part of the playbook. And again, Ken was a Mormon, just like the grifters who stole Dennis's Seattle company. So I doubt that was a coincidence. And again, back to the Mormon financial empire, I heard Greer say many years later that they were the ringleaders of the global elite. So I was like, oh, isn't that interesting? So yeah, so I doubt that was all coincidence. And I think what happened to us in Ventura was a more refined version of the playbook that was used on us in Seattle. They just took it to another level. So in Seattle, it was just a civil suit. One person, the state misunderstood one thing you said, and Bill was not an official. He was just a hitman, a corporate hitman. Well, they raised it to, we'll prosecute you for fraud there in Ventura. And use Ken to steal the company. So anyway, it was very familiar. So for me, it was kind of deja vu when I saw what happened to Ventura. It was like, oh, I've seen this show before. So in Seattle, which surprised me that he was able to dupe Stan, the engineer, because Stan saw this company get stolen in Seattle. In fact, when Stan told me that he was going to, I can put this on hold for just a minute. Yeah, so when Stan told me he was going to go work for Ken, and he and Mr. Research were going to work for Ken and his cronies, I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it at first. I couldn't believe it until I went to see Mr. Research, and I couldn't believe it. Yeah, these guys, in fact, Stan, to his credit, after all the dust settled, and he and Mr. Researcher actually did come out of hiding and refuge to testify for Dennis once Wayne and I busted him out of jail, and we had we had the the United States' leading constitutional attorney defending us during a prosecutorial misconduct hearing that we had. After all that was done, but Dennis still got rooked into for the judge took Dennis's attorney hostage to force him to a plea bargain, which of course never recognized. Then they kangarooed Dennis into prison, tried to get him murdered and stuff, which I've also discussed this in the past. Anyway, so Stan though, in the middle, it was just like a month or two before he died. He talked with Mr. Researcher and basically said they were a couple of saps. And that was to Stan's credit. He goes, "We're the saps of the world, easily being hoodwinked by people like Ken." Exactly. And this is, it was also a thing where Stan was going to go where promised to pay him. I mean, that's what that was about. So it's like, oh man. And so, yeah. And of course, like again, the employees cheering the theft of Dennis's company in Seattle. And again, my own boss engineering the theft of the company, et cetera. And in Ventura, the same thing. All the employees stole everything they could on the way out the door, and all this incredible ugliness. And but Ken, Bill Delp, Ken was also a contract agent. So yeah, so Ken was definitely put up to this. And is a contract agent. And contract agents will have to fend for themselves between stints. So again, like my relative who was a CIA contract agent who worked for Henry Kissinger. So yeah, the life of a CIA contract agent is not this wonderful, ain't a wonderful life. And so they're actually have to use their criminal talents, whatever talents they have, they're using. Bill, he ended up running a company in Florida. He ripped off his customers and stuff, and then threatened legal action against them. He used the legal system as a weapon and stuff. And Ken was later on, he got involved he was in a Mormon scam where they stole like $40 million from people. And Ken spent many years in prison, which is the only reason he's still alive. And the only reason I name him is because he spent many years in prison. So it was sufficiently defanged to where I feel comfortable naming him. So yeah, Mr. Deputy, I won't. There's a lot of people I won't name while they're still alive. I link to them though, so people who read my work, I link to these people so they can. It's easy to find out who they are. Dennis's book describe, discloses their identities, etc. So, yeah, so the Ventura events for me were not really all that educational. I mean, they were just more of this, at a higher level of what happened in Seattle. And yeah, in fact, when Stan told me he and Mr. Researcher were going to go work for Ken, it felt like I was in an invasion of the body snatchers. Everybody around me was turning into pod people. I mean, that's kind of how I refused to believe it at first. These guys would do that. And I tried to dissuade him. Oh, did I try to dissuade him? And unfortunately, neither of them got hurt too badly by that. But yeah, it was like, and these guys were old enough to be my dad, and older. And it's like, and they were just like a couple of 5-year-olds being lured into a car by a stranger holding a candy bar out the window. Yeah, it was my third of my 4 big awakening moments. I write about, etc. in my journey with Dennis. That was the third of the fourth, was that moment when there's Ken and his henchman Stu and Stan as I'm driving up to the office. And again, Ken had just chased off all the employees by essentially saying they'd be arrested if they kept working at our company. Yeah, that was one of my big awakening moments. And then again, I've discussed this before, so I won't get into it too much. But that's when I went to see Shaking Up Wayne, and for an hour I told him what I thought was happening. I was completely right, and then I went to see Mr. Researcher, and I was incredibly dismayed that he was defending his position, and again thinking that going to work for Ken and stuff was a good move. Yeah, in fact, when he had his shameful interview with Mr. Deputy that I heard, literally a couple of weeks later, he was disparaging me by saying that these guys were bad news. Yeah, part of me was hard to, again, even at that point in my journey, there was something that happened. It was hard for me to believe it. I couldn't believe these guys would be that. I couldn't believe these guys would be that naive and stupid to do something like that. And again, Stan had seen the movie before. So anyway. Human behavior could never surprise me again after that year was ended, of 1988. But the Ventura days were also highly educational from all the people that approached us. So we became this alternative mecca. before we were wiped out. We were like a beacon in the darkness for a short period of time before we got wiped out. And I mentioned before that when one of the guys who got a hold of me, again, Dennis was almost, the public couldn't get to Dennis in those days. We were so busy. And so people would get to me trying to get to Dennis. And one guy called me, who an inventor, as I recall, but he talked about how he talked to Einstein one day when he called Princeton's physics department. Einstein answered the phone. I've discussed that before. So that was a lighthearted moment. This guy's talking about talking to Albert Einstein when he was a kid, when he was young. Most of the stuff we heard though were nightmare stories, and I don't know if I think I did. Yeah, I think I've discussed this, so I don't get too much into it here. But we heard from a guy who was he was worth $400 million. Invested, he built a windmill farm in the American Southwest. I think this is in the 70s, and he was intending to sell electricity with the electric companies until he got a phone call one night that said they would kill his family by dawn unless he left and never looked back. And then the guy did a brief calculation, and he had invested 9% of his net worth. He invested like $35 million in his windmill farm. And he looked at the numbers and he considered the phone call. He said it wasn't worth it. So he left and never came back. In fact, he came to our office in a limousine and telling us, I wish you guys the best, but you don't know what you're in. You don't know what you're up against. And he was right. And so this is one. And then we also heard from a guy who was a partner of, in fact, a Cal State University professor, a chemist, and they came up with a way to mine platinum ore, to extract ore, platinum ore from ore that was considered unminable. And then they got wiped out. Again, Eastern oligarchy stuff, In fact, the professor simply disappeared. I think he was murdered. Yeah, likely murdered. And then the guy who we heard from, he slept in a chiropractor's back office for 2 years to stay alive in California. And so this is California stuff. And then I remember being approached, and I knew something. Again, back to when I was 12 years old, I started becoming familiar with the medical racket, I guess, when I was 12, when we changed our diets from processed food to whole food. And I knew something about the medical racket in those days, and I actually can't remember exactly what I knew, but I know that like Wayne, Mr. Professor, his wife, she had lots of health problems, allergies and stuff, chemical sensitivities, and Orthodox medicine did nothing for her. So she actually started doing alternatives, and she was hip. And I think I heard about some of this from her in those days. And then I worked for a medical lab. It was the powers being tried to wipe out a couple weeks after I started working there, more of the same. But there were a couple of elderly gentlemen who told me that they were at a conference where Max Gerson was poisoned. And it wasn't, and then a couple of years later, I read about the poisonings actually in Ralph Hovnanian's Medical Dark Ages. So he was poisoned with arsenic a couple times. And then once at a conference, it was his conference. And so this is, again, murders at conferences, attempted murders at conferences. Like Wayne's wife had also heard about this kind of stuff. So yeah, so this is conferences is suicidal. Yeah, free energy, alternative medicine and stuff. Holding conferences can be suicidal. And yeah, they have secret teams that, again, they kill people. This is what the spooks do. And they work for private interests. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, again, back to the CIA being privatizing covert action. So a lot of the spook stuff, like my relative was a contract agent, right? So off the books, private interests, this kind of stuff, and nakedly defending the rackets, so the global rackets that run the world economy. Yeah, so Max Gerson, he was curing cancer patients way back in the 40s. And in fact, he had recovered cancer patients on the floor of Congress trying to get a law passed to have these non-toxic treatments legalized, et cetera. And the medical record back then was so strong, they totally shut it down. And again, Max Gerson he had to leave the country. He had to go to Mexico to have a clinic there. And in fact, and then I've heard about people being murdered and kidnapped from Mexico. Again, this is how the FDA plays ball. In fact, Brian O'Leary's healer they kidnapped him from South America. He cured Brian of skin cancer with a non-toxic treatment. So yeah, all the stuff that works is outlawed in the United States. Only the attack the tumor stuff is allowed to be legal. Yeah, it's a racket. Like, again, they're all rackets, but that one's I'm particularly familiar with the medical racket, particularly the cancer racket. But I've become very familiar with the infectious disease racket in recent years, which I will get into that more another day. I've written about it plenty. we heard other stories there. Like I remember hearing about some free energy inventor, and his family was murdered, and they set the hire on house, set the house on fire and bulldozed it, which was the paralegal group that helped us right after we were raided to have we could file these civil rights lawsuits for what they did in the raid. I heard from the founder the same story. They set your place on fire and bulldoze it. So it seems to be part of the playbook. So anyway, you see this again, you see these experiences, and you see there's kind of a playbook these people use. Yeah, they've refined it. They have quite a playbook they can use. And so also in those days, so again, when I was trying to fuss Dennis out of jail, I learned that JFK, John Kennedy, was killed in a backfire CIA operation from Gary Wayne, the cop friend who gave me the advice that led to me springing Dennis from jail. And yeah, so he was killed in a backfire CIA operation, which the CIA was probably involved in the fake one and the real one, be my guess. And then when the original Watergate attorney heard from E. Howard Hunt, who ran the operation that Gary was told about that got Jack Kennedy killed, he said Kennedy was killed over the ET issue. And that fits right in. Yeah, so the ET, you got ETs, free energies. That's, I call it spook central. Yeah, so the spooks swarm and swirl around these issues. And yeah, so my life ruining ordeal there in Ventura, which I really don't talk a lot about my personal end of that until more people die. I won't be able to disclose that publicly. People can read Dennis's books and find out about it, but I don't disclose it publicly while some people are still alive, if I outlive them. Um, and so, yeah, so Ventura County is one of the most corrupt, if not the most corrupt county in the United States, which I didn't learn about that while I was growing up. And again, I call California the most corrupt state in the United States, and that's for good reason. So, literally just a few years before we went through, Mark Cummings had his experience there, where he invented a free energy prototype in the basement of Lawrence Berkeley, and then he was fired, arrested, and interrogated in an underground facility. And then he moves to Southern California under an assumed name and secretly thinks he's going to do it. And he gets found out. They clean out his lab, and then Mark realized he was in over his head. And then in later adventures of Mark, he worked at a company, and he was working with guys who were familiar with this world, and they were, and he heard story after story of free energy inventors and what they went through. And again, there's nowhere to run and hide, and they get killed or just, Brian O'Leary knew about 25 den inventor stories, and again, a lot of them were from California. So Mark had his ordeal in California. Back at the same time we were being wiped out there in Ventura, Rodney Stitch was kangarooed into prison in California by the CIA and friends. And Rodney Stitch was the guy who was the FAA investigator who was assigned in the 60s to the United Airlines, was dumping plane loads of people, several plane crashes. And Rodney discovered that it was all pilot error because United Airlines wasn't training his pilots properly. And he wrote a book called Unfriendly Skies. And then he got in far deeper than he wanted to. The spooks, also he was associated with all sorts of spooks. And he's the guy actually who became privy to what's called the Pegasus tapes, which is a wiretap on J. Edgar Hoover's phone by the FBI. Wire had their own director's phone, and he was privy to the tapes that had Hoover with Lyndon Johnson and Nelson Rockefeller and George Bush the first and Allen Dulles, and they were planning the JFK hit. Yeah, they got him on tape planning the hit, planning the assassination. So Rodney Stitch was kangarooed into prison in California by the CIA and friends in '88. The same, literally, like in March of '88, he got kangarooed into prison just as we're being wiped out. Yeah, this is California. That's how it works. And then Gary Wayne, in fact, the year before that, Gary Wayne published his book on his odyssey from the year, his odyssey of the incredible corruption there in Ventura County and LA. And again, Jewish mobsters and all this kind of stuff, And so anyway, so when I say that Ventura County, in fact, in Gary's book, he mentioned that when he was having his battles with particularly the Ninth District Court of Appeals Court there in California, which is the Western United States, he found out that its reputation was as the most corrupt federal court in the United States, considered the Wild West court. Yeah, or again, just gangster. Again, Gary knew a gangster who eventually sat on the bench there, Harry Pregerson, who actually presided over the Snowden case. Yeah, and so Pregerson was a thorn in Gary's side for many years, and Gary, he thought, in fact, he had evidence that Pregerson was put through law school by Mickey Cohen, the gangster who ran LA's crime scene. So anyway, all interconnects. Anyway, so when I say California is the most corrupt state in the United States, I ain't joking. So anyway, so what I just described to you, the threats, the murders, other assaults, etc. Um, Many of those, most of those, and maybe even all of those are spook related. But because they're spook related, the evidence is tenuous. And so what ends up happening is you start seeing pattern recognition. Oh, this is the same scenario. Again, the same thing happened in Seattle, happened in Ventura. Isn't that interesting? And you start trading notes with fellow travelers, and they start telling you the same thing. And that's how I put together a lot of my view, is that I found out the stuff we're living through was normal. This is the playbook. This is how the globalists play ball. And there's a line, an endless line of corrupt officials waiting to do their bidding. All your associates are also piling on, trying to steal it, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, this is back to my 1% conspiracy, 99% complicity. Yeah, I lived through enough times. And that's, again, it wasn't just, I just saw it over and over, and then trading notes with fellow travelers, Brian and others, hearing the story, hearing Mark tell his story, and so I don't know how all those dots connect, but I know that most of them do. But you'll find people who will try to dismiss it all. Skeptics are good at this. Oh, no, none of those dots connect. It's all just a coincidence. Again, or the structuralists. Oh, it's all structural. Nobody's really pulling the strings there. It's all just kind of the natural way things, the outcome happens. Well, not really. So again, that CIA's offer for Dennis to go away, the $1 billion offer to go away, that's a horse of a different color, which in this milieu we found out that was kind of typical. I mean, he had to play at a high level. So again, the average inventor's garage got the $10 million or whatever, or the $500,000, this kind of thing. It was only when you were like a Dennis or a Greer, you're threatening, you're leading a big movement. Then they start bringing out the big guns, and then Greer, just, the next decade, Greer almost died himself. In fact, his team died as they got advanced and strange forms of cancer right after they held congressional hearings on UFOs. Yeah, so to me, the UFO, ET, free energy, anti-gravity, that's all connected. It's all interconnected. And I said, well, my friend saw his underground technology show, several years after my Ventura ordeal. My guess is that was mostly from reverse engineered DT tech. Be my guess. Yeah, it's probably a pretty good guess. That's probably what the situation is. Although some of it we may have, some variations we came up with. But I understand is the bulk of that has come from captured ET tech, which gets disparaged by the mainstream and the skeptics, etc. But yeah, those who think there are no connections between what I was just describing are deluded, or defending their belief systems, their fantasies of how the world really works. Or they're performing their jobs to keep the public mind, collective mind managed. Like Mr. Skeptic and the skeptics and stuff. So they're good at that. Yeah. And again, I'll get to, before these are over, it's like the leading skeptics, like space skeptics. People in my circles, they would actually brag to them about their CIA NSA connections as they're doing debunking work. Yeah, so they're basically admitting they work with the spooks. And I think this is all, it's not, yeah, I'm highly confident in the things I'm asserting here, just because I saw the same stuff happening over and over again, and then trading those other people, and it's like, oh, that happened to you. This is what happened to us. This kind of thing. So yeah, so Dennis had the attention of the global elite at least since his Seattle days, and I've had to assume I've been under surveillance since the '80s. Yeah, so yeah, probably since I became Dennis's partner, be my guess. I've been under surveillance. And so this comes the territory. So far, they just listen. And I'm trying to do stuff where all they're going to do is listen. They're not going to try to take me out. That's my hope anyway. We'll see how it goes. And again, people that I try to get involved with what I'm doing, if they follow my cautions, I'm here as an Indian guide. If they follow my cautions, they'll be fine. They're not going to get in trouble. But if they run out there and they're going to tell their family and friends and businesses and colleagues about it, free energy, the gospel, that's a good way to get in trouble. But again, not from the global elite. It's just from their social circles, will ostracize them, get them fired, and ruin their careers, which I've seen this over and over now. And so, yeah, but in order to get the attention of the global elite, you have to do what Dennis did, what I'm doing. We had Mark had their attention for a while, what Brian was doing. Yeah, you do that kind of stuff and you start getting the attention of the global elite. What Greer has been doing, this kind of stuff. So yeah, that's when you get their attention. And so there's also white hats out there, and ultimately, God's in charge. So all paths lead to the Godhead, and so in my sort of take on all this is humanity still trying to grow up and become a sentient species. So all the things so personal integrity is a real scarce as a commodity. Yes, it is. But it's also what's most precious, and it's the key to an effort like mine succeeding. I have to find the people, again, those disillusioned idealists who had the integrity, who believed in the ideal, who really learned it was a fairy tale. But I'm here to tell them that the ideal is attainable. But every step towards the ideal has to be consistent with the ideal because the means become the ends, which is my great metaphysical mentor Seth told me once. So anyway, that's all I have for this session. And again, a lot more to come. There wasn't a lot more to come. There will be a lot more to come because this story isn't close to being over.